Hello, and welcome. I'm Bill Hartung. I'm a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute. For those of you who don't know Quincy, we're an action-oriented think tank that promotes ideas that move U.S. foreign policy away from endless war towards diplomacy in pursuit of international peace. So needless to say, we've got work to do. So you can learn more about our work at our website, quincyinst.org. That's quincyinst.org. And feel free to check out our online magazine, Responsible Statecraft, which you just Google it, it'll pop up right away. So I'll be moderating today's panel, Bankers and Bombs, How Venture Capital and Private Equity Are Feeding the Military-Industrial Complex. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors, Security and Context, and the Middle East Forum at the George Washington University. I'm very interested in what we have to say and what I can learn. I've spent a good part of my career tracking the big companies, the Lockheed Martins, the Northrop Grummans, and this is a whole other sector, which is going to be increasingly important as the Pentagon moves towards its kind of strategy of AI-directed weapons and swarms of drones and all the things that they've been kind of talking about in recent times. And our panelists can enlighten us on the kind of the pros and cons of this development. First person that I want to introduce is Shana Marshall. She's the Associate Director, Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University, Elliott School of International Affairs. She's also a non-resident fellow here at the Quincy Institute. Edward Anguesso is a writer and editor focused on finance, technology, and labor. He's the finance editor of Logix magazine, and he co-hosts the podcast This Machine Kills, which focuses on the political economy of technological innovation. Jonathan Geyer is a senior foreign policy writer at Vox, and prior to that, he was the managing editor of the American Prospect. So just to jump in, Shana, this phenomenon of private capital surging into the arms sector, how new is it? How significant is it? What kind of red flags does it raise for you? Why did you decide to do research on this?
Thanks, Bill, and thanks so much to the Institute for putting this together. So I'll start by zooming out a little bit, pointing to some broad structural factors, and then I'll dig down for some more concrete illustrations. So basically, U.S. industrial policy has two parts, right? One is to pour as much money as possible into the military-industrial complex through the huge Pentagon budget. And then on the other hand, don't tax the super rich and try to incentivize them to put their surplus capital into the economy to finance infrastructure and technological research and all the things that the economy needs to grow. Of course, when they're pouring that money in, it's going to be sucked into the sector that the U.S. state really does continue to subsidize, which is not public infrastructure or hospitals or education or any of the things that we actually need, but it's the military, industrial, and defense tech sector. So we see venture capital or VC and private equity funds putting their surplus capital into military technologies and defense tech startups, and they're developing their own in-house funds and cultivating managers whose backgrounds are in defense and military production, either as coming out of government contracting or in many cases military veterans who have expertise in the technologies that the military actually uses in war. This convergence between, on the one hand, surplus capital in the form of VC and private equity, on the one hand, and military industrial production on the other, is facilitated in a number of really interesting ways. So on the one hand, you have financial actors who are attempting to reform the way that the U.S. state actually does business, so that defense tech startups actually have easier access to the military industrial complex. They're essentially lowering the barriers to entry. One great example, I think, is Leonid Bank, which is actually an invoice factoring company that essentially lends money to defense tech startups based on the DoD invoices that those startups have secured for future projects, providing them with more money, right, over and above that contract value, so that they can expand production and research. And this is not something that has actually ever existed for Pentagon contracts. It's very common in commercial industry all over the world, lending to companies based on expected future invoice payments. But this is not something that we have ever seen in relation to U.S. government contracts for military projects. So that's just one very concrete example. And then you have financiers from VC and private equity themselves going to these startups that initially are working on civilian technologies and steering those startups toward the development of technologies that have military applications, precisely because the prospects for financial returns on those products are much larger. Right. So you have, of course, examples from Silicon Valley, Google and Amazon, of course, that are large, well-established tech firms that develop technologies that subsequently become critical to the US military. But you have hundreds of smaller startups that are replicating this experience at much earlier stages of development. Right? Maybe they're working on technologies to improve navigation in driverless vehicles. And then the military comes to them and they say, hey, can you focus on a version of this technology that we can apply to our weapons targeting systems? And of course, the funding for that is much more secure and much more substantial. And so that startup may abandon the commercial research focus entirely and shift into becoming a more purely sort of defense tech focused firm. There's tons of examples of this. Scale AI is a good recent example, but there's probably hundreds, if not really thousands of similar cases. The VC firms themselves, they're general partners and they're more expertise, subject matter driven deal partners who are the ones who go out and find and evaluate the potential firms to invest in and who may have, a background in military and security organizations, are also supplying policy papers and practical guidance to the Pentagon and the broader U.S. national security establishment about how to best reshape the contracting ecosphere in order to facilitate the participation of more defense startups. And here I'd like to reference this recent white paper from one of the most well-known VC funds, Andreessen Horowitz, which has grasped onto this new craze over a treatable warfare, which of course is derived from the word attrition, but it's basically a model of warfare that focuses on using technology to develop cheaper, simpler weapons in much larger numbers, which has sort of become all the rage in the VC startup, private equity, defense tech investment world, because it obviously fits squarely into their production model. So the folks at Andreessen Horowitz offer a kind of blueprint for what this transition needs. And I'm going to quote just briefly here from that paper because I think it's incredibly illuminating. So they say, as general computing platforms become applicable to a host of defense applications, from programming autonomous behavior to conducting live targeting analysis, sweeping advances in software and other technologies not originally designed for defense have unintentionally compounded computing's impact on war. And then they say, responding to the paradigm shift requires re-engineering the Pentagon's DNA for a new era. The authors emphasize that this re-engineering will allow for, quote, a reduction in operational complexity, driving lower costs through commoditization with smaller, modular, modern production that uses just-in-time manufacturing techniques like 3D printing to cut latency. Allowing for, very importantly, the decentralization of a military's industrial footprint. This sounds a little crazy, right? Like outsourcing military industrial supply chains and globalizing production. But of course, Bill, as you know, and as anyone knows who's been looking at the military industrial complex for the past few decades, we already know that most of the huge weapons platforms that are used by the U.S. military incorporate parts and materials from suppliers all over the world, including a lot of stuff from China. So this is really more about letting these startups into the production chain that is currently dominated by the large prime contractors, right? Lockheed, Northrop, Raytheon, which of course are pointedly not interested in the cost cutting and the modular production forms, right, that would challenge their dominance in the sector. And part of VC's allure to the Pentagon is precisely this startup ethos that it promises. And it depicts the major primes, Lockheed, Raytheon, Northrop, as these rigid dinosaurs that are structurally unable to develop or deliver the kind of hardware that the military truly needs, unless the Pentagon is willing to overhaul the nature of its military contracting and weapons development in partnership with venture capital and private equity. Another way that Andreessen Horowitz gets to this is through advocating for something that they call broad and open API standards. API referring to application programming interfaces, presumably to enable these defense startups to explore adjustments to complex, expensive defense platforms in order to find ways to produce those items more cheaply, make them more durable, propose alternate configurations, or introduce cheaper or more widely available materials outside the current military industrial contracting model. They make reference to Lockheed Martin's famous Skunk Works unit, right, that itself operated exactly like a startup, right, free from corporate bureaucracy, responsible to no one, and able to, as the tech sector loves to say, move fast and break things in order to achieve the development of new technologies much more quickly. And so to bring that back and to sort of wrap up and point to a real world sort of justification for the promotion of this reshaping and decentralization of military production, the authors of this particular paper reference the war in Ukraine multiple times in this proposal. And we've seen the sort of near hysteria, right, in the U.S. military establishment over the war in Ukraine, specifically related to shortages, right, of lower tech munitions and drones that are caused by this war, which features these two modern militaries who are just burning through conventional weaponry at a rate that is much faster, right, than the recent asymmetric wars that the U.S. has been involved in. They reference the war in Ukraine multiple times, but then of course they also have to reference, the folks who are less worried about Ukraine and more worried about China, right? So the proposal has something for sort of every type of war hawk, including those who are more focused on the Pacific. They say this regenerative capacity of this new model will be critical in other mission environments like the Pacific, where logistics chains could stretch for thousands of miles. So I think these examples show us in sort of broad strokes how there are these broad structural factors that are pushing this convergence of finance, the tech sector, and the military industrial complex, and then how specific actors within that ecosphere are providing the sort of the tangible mechanisms and the directions, the banking tools, the policy prescriptions to actually further catalyze and solidify that relationship.
Wow, that's an excellent overview. My first reaction is it's going to make my Lockheed Martin book obsolete. Then the fact that it's 12 years old.
I doubt it.
I think that this whole sector has gotten minimal attention. Deputy Secretary of Defense Kathleen Hicks did give a speech to the National Defense Industrial Association, the biggest arms industry trade group, kind of touting this new approach. She didn't talk so much about how it's going to be financed, but just these replicable weapons and how they're going to put us in a position to keep China on their guard. And they talked about swarms of drones that could hit thousands of targets in China in short order. So it's the wave of the future from the Pentagon's point of view. But I think from what I've seen so far, there's more money going into this sector from private sources than the Pentagon is spending itself. In fact, some of the smaller companies call the Pentagon's approach theater because they're not backing it up with big money yet, partly because they're so used to funding the big contractors. Now, Jonathan, you've written about this going back at least, I think, 4 years or so. And in one aspect, kind of the political connections and political implications of this. But in general, what drew you to this subject and what sort of jumped out at you when you started digging into it?
Yeah, so thanks so much for hosting this, Bill. I sort of am an accidental business reporter, I like to say, because I started tracking what the Obama administration officials and then later where Trump administration officials went in the private sector. And a lot of it was private equity and venture capital or consulting firms that were all connected to this burgeoning space of defense tech. So what I wanted to point out up front is I love the title Bankers and Bombs, but the bombs here are not necessarily things that go boom, and it makes them a lot harder to cover for us as reporters. A lot of this tech is data processing, machine learning, repackaged as very hyped up AI for the military or intelligence services. So even just yesterday, the CIA announced it has a kind of chat GPT-like platform it's using. The Pentagon is experimenting with technologies very similar to DALL-E. But at its core, and I think Shane identified some of these questions, the Pentagon is pretty bad at this stuff in terms of adaptation. And what's interesting too is the private sector ain't so great either. So what my reporting has really looked at is how a lot of the hype around startups, which have gotten a tremendous amount of venture capital, a tremendous amount of revolving door power on their boards, and sort of the Plummis platforms in Washington and Aspen and so forth, the tech doesn't always work all that well, but it's still really growing quick. And a lot of these startups are fundraising off of the threat of China or the perceived threat of China. A lot of these technologies are being experimented on in Ukraine. If you look at the kind of CEOs and billionaires who have visited Ukraine, you have the CEO of Palantir has been there. Eric Schmidt, who's the former Google CEO, has been to Ukraine. To me, a lot of this is somewhat reminiscent of the war on terrorism and the way that new technologies are being leveraged through these perceived threats. Another aspect of this that I would love to see more reporting on is how sovereign wealth funds from countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, countries that are close US partners, but obviously have pretty grievous human rights violations and are quite far from sharing democratic values with the United States, are investing hugely in defense tech, and including some of the rising US companies are directly or indirectly getting a lot of Saudi funds. So yeah, I'm excited today. We could talk about some of the particular individuals like Tony Blinken and the consulting firm he co-founded, West Exec Advisors, which was very deeply involved and as far as I can tell, still very deeply involved in this world. We could talk about the more traditional defense contractors like Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, who was obviously at Raytheon. We could go way back, talk about Carlyle Group or Henry Kissinger advising defense contractors in the 80s, which set the stage for this. Or I think we could go into the future a little bit. And I think here space is, well, it's the space to watch. I mean, satellites and satellite destroyers are probably the hottest defense tech investment space right now. This industry has been galvanized, I think, by the Chinese balloon and the controversy of it, but was already kind of booming long before that. But to me, I think the core interesting question raised by this panel and by Shana's presentation is sort of the connection between Silicon Valley and the Pentagon, and what, the narrative that's taken hold in the trade press and the tech and defense press, and among a lot of the so-called thought leaders in the think tank world that's underwritten by a lot of these companies, is this idea of the valley of death, that these technologies from Silicon Valley, rather than being able to get directly to the Pentagon, kind of die on the vine in the pathways, that the contracting doesn't work, that it's not suited for these new technologies, that, there's too much bureaucracy, there's not enough money. I sort of think that's not really true. I think it's a self-serving narrative that this so-called valley of death exists that keeps Silicon Valley and the Pentagon quite far apart. And I think the revolving door aspect of this, the fact that so many Obama and Trump officials have gone into these startups that are doing defense tech, suggests that that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Or the fact that Silicon Valley at its core historically emerges from the Pentagon. I mean, these links are really deep-seated, but this narrative of a valley of death whereby these advanced technologies are not making to the Pentagon has such currency in Washington right now that it's something I'm utterly fascinated by. And I'm excited to hear what you, Ed, and others have to add to this conversation.
Great, thanks. On the issue of, who goes into the industry, I have a piece coming out on what do generals and admirals do when they retire. And, some of them go to the big companies and their boards, but increasingly they're going to small startups. They're going to companies that invest in tech. You see a migration in terms of how the revolving door is working. Now, Edward, you've been a longtime critic of the venture capital industry in general and the funding of, surveillance and technologies of control and so forth. How do you see the work you've done kind of fitting into this development, or how do you reflect on some of the stuff that Shana and Jonathan have been talking about?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question, and thanks for hosting as well. I think that, venture capital is part of a larger, political economy of tech development in this country, where there are a few guiding principles. One is that it's going to be privately financed and decided, and so it's insulated from popular concerns and needs and interests, as well as, as a result of that, it's insulated from things that might be better suited towards social goods or services, public goods or services. And if you're going to do private financing, insulation from democratic input and goods and services that are not public, you're gonna do military-oriented things, right? Or commercial aspects, or business to business, right? So that I think sets sort of the frame and the channel in which venture capital comes in, right? Since the initial, venture capital comes onto the scene, or starts to, grow in the, post-war period immediately after negotiations and debates about what to do with the defense spending, and as the Cold War peaks up. But it doesn't really explode until there are reforms that allow more institutions, specifically pension funds, to throw their money with it, and until larger technology firms and sort of hubs of development, such as Fairchild Semiconductor, which was responsible for some of the core and fundamental technological innovations at the foundation of the digital economy, have their workers, have their employees, have their managers spread throughout the industry, right? And take with them an idea about how technology should be funded, designed, and insulated from popular control, but also relationships with the government and a prioritization of those relationships with the government. And so venture, I think that it's not a surprise that venture capital is beginning to or not beginning to, but more enthusiastically, more openly pursuing militarized technologies or defense tech, right? We're terming it as defense tech because for years they've already been, having this close relationship with the state. But there's also been a modern metastasizing of this, right? As at home, there have been discussions of antitrust regulations that would undermine some of the value proposition of these venture capital funds, right? Because they're offering excessive returns to people who are parking their money with them. And part of the way that they've been able to try to do that is by rolling up a market using capital as a weapon. And if there has been at home a domestic surge in antitrust and regulatory frameworks that prevent that, a really good salve has been to say, well, we need large national champions to compete with other countries. These are part of our national interests. This is part of our geopolitical strategy. This is part of our Cold War with China, and with any strategy that might be an industrial policy to try to compete with them. That might be a geopolitical strategy to contain them or deny them access to key parts of the technological stack, to try to purge our allies or ourselves of telecommunication firms that come from China, so on and so forth. Venture capital is going to take advantage of that opportunity, of course, to back firms that can fill that hole, at the same time also being reluctant to step away from the firms that it is backing in China or backing in other countries that might be in competition with the United States, or be framed as in competition with the United States, right? So I think the backdrop for venture capital is it will take advantage of almost any opportunity it sees in front of it, but that there's been a bunch of marshaling with the development of this antitrust and then techno-nationalism to respond, with the ascendance of much more military-minded startups, right? Anduril and Palantir, some of the two prominent examples, right? With the decisions, slow decisions to kind of drop the pretense about not wanting to do weaponry, or is insisting, like, as Jonathan said, we're not going to do bombs, but we are going to do almost all the technology that is just as lethal and fatal in one way or another, right? We're not gonna support or finance hypersonic missiles, but we will support militarization of the border and coming up with better ways to train drones so that they can discriminate and figure out who to kill, right? Or figure out better ways to, as Palantir does, right? Plug in and support operations to deport people, operations for intelligence services, so on and so forth, right? And so I think as there's been this larger shift, there's just been a lot of opportunities for venture capitalists to port over their ideologies and their eagerness for private development of technology that provides them with opportunities to get a cut of the return, get a cut of the profits, get a cut of the anything of the take, essentially. And present themselves as a solution to the government, to the Pentagon, and also to other parts of the sector that are looking at this developing relationship and saying they want to get in on the pie as well.
Yeah, thanks. On the issue of producing components rather than big platforms, I used to debate this guy from the lobbyist for the aerospace industry, and he was kind of a character. But he always say, "Well, most of our members don't make things that go boom and kill people." But of course, they did make things that help them target, coordinate, be more precise, and so forth. So, it was kind of a throwaway line that didn't quite add up. The other thing is, from the military point of view, there's these enthusiasms for technical solutions to complex global problems. So in Vietnam, it was the electronic battlefield. In the Rumsfeld years, it was the revolution of military affairs. There's been a longstanding kind of embrace of precision-guided weapons. And there's been a lot of glitches in actually making those things work. And when they do work, after many years and much investment, they're often not relevant. I mean, they cause damage, but the U.S. couldn't, win a war in Iraq or Afghanistan against poorly armed adversaries, given all the tech in the world. And the idea of, using this strategy to deal with China rather than a sort of a diplomatic, economic, sort of more balanced approach, I think is a recipe for disaster. So I had a question for the panel, kind of a devil's advocate question. I've talked to various reporters and people in the think tank world and so forth about this development, and they all think it's a great thing. Well, the Pentagon wants these new technologies, big companies aren't innovative enough. This is where, it's all going to happen. What's wrong with that argument? Anybody who wants to?
I'll jump in there because I mean, a lot of the investors in this space who I've been getting to know are hugely patriotic, hugely, mission driven is the buzzword. The threat perceived of China eating our lunch is real to them. And as I say, it's reminiscent of the war on terrorism, or it's reminiscent of the Cold War. But it's true that it's probably better for the United States to have a lot of these technologies. The problem that I see here is, what are the guardrails? What are the ethical boundaries? Are we selling these technologies to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates or Bahrain, where there's hundreds of political prisoners on hunger strike? What's Israel doing with these technologies? How are they affecting Palestinians in the context of daily surveillance under occupation? Let's develop these technologies if that's sort of the mission-driven approach. But I'd really like to see a code of conduct that is sort of conceived of by ethicists and lawyers and human rights activists, grassroots constituents. So I liked what Ed said about, so much of private capital is decisions are being made privately behind closed doors. but this is really a public good. If it's truly about national security and defense, like, okay, let's set the boundaries, the guidelines, the guardrails, and have a serious public discussion about it. Shayna brought up Scale AI, which the White House, I believe, is bringing in as one of its partners to determine some of its ethical ideas around how to use generative AI. Not the choice I would make to bring in a private company to make some of those public decisions. Obviously, I'm a reporter, not a government official, so maybe there's some great insight I'm not aware of. But as Senator Elizabeth Warren has raised, there's just a tremendous coziness right now between the private sector and government industry on this set of issues that is really frightening stuff. So yeah, let's develop the hell out of these new technologies, but let's also develop the most robust safeguards so that, the same Leahy laws or other kind of, tenets of U.S. democracy are brought to bear here.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Edward, please.
I just wanted to add quickly, I think also, as Jonathan talked about, Sean has talked about, right, that we are building and putting in hundreds of $billion into armaments that are not being used, but are being used to rationalize, being used further, being used to rationalize, further expanding it, right? There are just questions to consider about what's the effect of constantly pouring all this money into this, inculcating investors, asset managers, technologists, scientists, to drive the direction of technological development, and also the missions and objectives and the design principles of our technology to be for fighting a war just around the corner, or for militarizing, or for surveilling, or for instituting social control, right? A lot of the people who are invested or in this space also, some of them pride themselves in not supporting technologies that they think are particularly exploitative, surveillance, lethal, but at the same time are building towards that, right? If we are sitting here and saying, or if people are sitting here and saying that they, for example, are concerned about these investments because they want to compete with China, because they think that China has artificial intelligence, which is antithetical to our values, then what do they think is the drift or the erosion of the values that are going to happen here if all we keep prioritizing is lethal tech, is surveillance tech, is infrastructure to build that up and to offer it is infrastructure to take commercialized tech and turn it into something that can be militarized without much investment, interest, or concern in building things out that might be for no purpose other than to make people's lives easier when it comes to healthcare, whether it comes to transit, whether it comes to the public goods or services that are neglected, or when they are taken care of, handed over completely, right, to the private sector, much like this national security and defense tech industry is being at the moment.
Yeah, Shayna.
I immediately to me, I see that limiting these technologies or their export to places like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, China, and Israel would be basically impossible, because that's where as John Dillinger said, that's where the money is, right? The money that's in these private equity funds is largely coming from probably outside the United States, right? We know this for decades, right? These large state-owned investment funds from the Gulf, right, is what has been pouring money into Silicon Valley, literally, right, for decades. So the idea that we could sort of develop those technologies using their money and then deny them the use of those technologies, I think is probably a pipe dream. A lot of people probably don't remember this, but the Dubai ports scandal, right, in like the early aughts, maybe, when the Emirates was trying to buy its way into U.S. cargo ports, right, along the East Coast, created this enormous scandal. And what they learned from that is, instead of trying to buy these assets using a state-named company, we'll put our money in private equity and we'll access these assets through the back door, basically. And that's also why there's been so much effort to sort of burnish the reputation of Mohammed bin Salman and Saudi Arabia more broadly, is because Saudi financing is so embedded in and necessary to the production of continued US military technologies, and the entire VC private equity infrastructure, meaning the entire sort of financial sector in the US and globally, is so important that there is no way to extricate these actors from this system. I mean, Saudi Arabia is very quick to and can very easily, punish the United States. I mean, they withdrew, a bunch of their, holdings of U.S. Treasury bonds, which they were presumably committed to not doing through prior agreements. And they were very quick to do that. And it hurt the U.S. Treasury. They were supposed to tell the U.S. Treasury before they did it if they ever planned on doing it, so that the U.S. Treasury could buy back those bonds and not have them floating on the open market. So there's, the idea that Saudi Arabia doesn't have the tools necessary to make sure that they get what they want out of that bargain, I think, to me, suggests that the U.S. regulatory system, or that U.S. business more broadly, even has the ability or the capacity to sort of limit those technologies. And of course, they're developing their own technologies domestically, right? The UAE is consistently and vocally, developing weapons technologies and partnering with firms specifically in order to circumvent the international trade and armaments regulations that prohibit the export of certain U.S. technologies to certain places. They've been pretty successful at doing that, and they're going to become, as they plow more and more money into that sector, more and more successful. So the idea that we can somehow sort of limit the fallout from this, I think, is not likely.
Well, on that optimistic note, just in a few minutes, I think we should open to questions. Use the Q&A function to do that. Two brief thoughts I had was, one, in the big ticket items, the fighter planes and so forth, the market is fairly structured. There's a few big players. It's hard for a country to build its own fighter plane industry. But I wonder, in some of these technologies, whether they would proliferate more easily, and to countries that would use them to ill effect. And also, just in terms of use in warfare, autonomous or robotic weapons reduce the decision time and sometimes even take humans out of the loop, which could lead to, as Michael Clare has noted in a report he did for the Arms Control Association, unintended slaughter, and also in the nuclear field, the risk of escalation or accidental nuclear war. So in addition to the kind of financing and political relations that come out of this, the products that they're helping accelerate are extremely dangerous. And in terms of rules of the road, there should be some focus on that, not just an arms race in this, but some ways to control how these things may be used, which I acknowledge would be very difficult. So do any of the panelists have things that they are dying to say that have yet to be said before we go to questions?
I would just say that, speaking directly to that last comment, that when you read these pieces, like the Andreessen Horowitz piece, you can very clearly see that they're not just speaking to the US military, right? They are speaking broadly to militaries across the world. And then you see that narrative then replicated in arms industry lobbying documents, right? Because the drive right now is to reform the Pentagon's contracting process to make it more focused on major importers of US arms, primarily in the Middle East, and to facilitate the sort of reshaping of that process so that it's easier for other countries to import US military systems. And so if you read between the lines of a lot of these things, you can very clearly see that these defense tech firms are not limiting they're not limiting their horizons to selling to the U.S. military, but it's very much about it's a global industrial strategy.
Great. Go ahead, Edward.
I would also say, I remember Jonathan had mentioned about how there is a kind of underreporting of the influence of the sovereign wealth funds. And I think that the sovereign wealth funds also have, in Saudi Arabia and UAE, have a larger influence in that, the capital that they generate from oil revenues and from investments that they're using to support their state are also being turned into capital that they can use to undermine industries elsewhere in their own public sectors and their welfare states, right? And so the proliferation of their involvement in the arms industry also results in contracting of other avenues that people might have to say, hey, let's reallocate funds from our defense sector into the public sector, right? Because they'll come in with backing up startups, backing up private unicorns that will cannibalize what's left of that, right? And so it ends up, letting a lot of these hordes of capital, fester and proliferate and spread, ends up also being something that accelerates the logic of financialization and the logic of militarization that's going on here as well.
Okay, Jonathan, do you have any additional words?
I wanted to add one smaller point, which is to something you said earlier, Bill, about kind of innovation theater being very hot in Pentagon circles. Many of the key departments, Air Force, Pentagon writ large, have established these kind of investment offices that kind of serve as a way to grease the wheels between a lot of these venture firms and startups and the Pentagon, which, as I was kind of arguing before, I'm not sure we need to grease those wheels. Seems like they're pretty friendly already. But so there's one called the Office of Strategic Capital, which just is a walking and talking potential conflict of interest, according to some of the reporting I've done. There are these kind of innovation labs and units that are in Silicon Valley, in Austin, that are all Pentagon linked, and they host a lot of like TED Talk style events. And, they're always bringing in startup founders to hang out, and kind of, it's very vibes based as far as I can tell. But, the actual money that's being put in through these like innovation grants, you might call them, are pretty minuscule. So just an interesting space to watch.
Great. Well, there's a question about kind of, can non-state actors turn the tables? Could they disable computer-dependent weapons? Could they develop their own, types of this to use in their activities? Basically, is there a chance that this could be turned around, or is this sort of going to be just the domain of states?
Well, we're seeing that with, I think, drone production in terms of, drones are now not such a hot technology, but if we go back 15 years and remember in the early days of the Obama administration, drones were super cutting edge, and every story about a drone was sort of like, whoa, what is this new thing? So I think with the production of Iranian, Turkish, Russian, very cheap drones, and then the ability of a lot of non-state actors to use drone technologies, that's sort of like a preview of what might happen, I think, with machine learning technologies, cyber warfare, any number of the kind of technologies we're talking about today. I mean, it is only a matter of time, I think, before a lot of these tools not only will be in the hands of autocratic governments, like what we've seen with the NSO group, Israeli spyware technologies, but also things that are much more difficult to explain or conceive, but have real world implications.
Yeah, Shanna, did you have something to add? Or
I would say that's absolutely the answer to that is yes, right? But that kind of obsolescence, right, is only a justification for demanding additional funding to be poured into this sector, right, to patch the holes, to develop the next gen version of whatever system it is, right? So to the people in the industry, the spread of that technology is an asset, not a problem, right? It actually builds in, renewed demand. It is basically sort of like a guaranteed long-term business model. So, and when you read a lot of the stuff from these VC firms, from the tech firms, the issue of the spread and leakage of that technology, if it is addressed at all, is that, the solutions that they have to that are basically like better cybersecurity technologies, which I don't see any evidence from the past, 10 or 15 years that that is on the horizon, or that they're actually, if you physically, if the drone crashes it is very easy to reverse engineer, that material. And so I don't see any kind of real sort of argument coming from these VC places about what to do in that eventuality. And I think that's because, for them, it's not really an issue.
Yeah, the other thing I'm wondering about, which is more of a moderator concern than a question from the audience, is at the moment there's some tension between the startups and the big firms, and they claim the big firms are getting all the money. Presumably that will change. I mean, I think at the moment it appears that private equity is spending more on this stuff than the Pentagon itself. But so the question will become, are they going to make choices? Are they just going to add this on top of the stuff they're already doing, which is a kind of a historical trend of theirs? I mean, we've got a Pentagon budget that's already tending towards $1 trillion. How high are they willing to go, I think, is the question. I don't have an answer to that, but I think we have to keep an eye on that. Now let's see what else is of interest. Somebody asked about the sort of the jobs issue, and I'm curious, I wonder how this will affect it, this kind of move towards different kinds of technology. Will there be fewer production jobs in the big platforms, and how many people do you need in these small firms to develop some of these technologies and so forth? And the industry has already been declining in employment for years. I mean, the one of the big industry associations has a report that says there were 3 million workers directly manufacturing weapons 30 years ago. Now there's 1 million. So there's already outsourcing, there's automation, there's various ways to diminish the need for workers. And I wonder if this will accelerate that, or if we don't know enough to figure that out.
I think of this in similarly, I think about when venture capital's influence and effect on employment in other sectors, right? There are some types of work, where, for example, gig workers, the population of gig workers grows despite the fact that there's a massive rate of attrition, like something like 90 to 95% of drivers, last time data was compiled by Uber, would quit within 6 months. If we want to promote a healthy and sustainable ecosystem and a system of employment for the drivers, getting rid of Uber and Lyft might help in one way, but another is like actually figuring out how do we address the fact that a lot of these people were underemployed or were working for a firm that was exploiting them and wasn't putting them their labor in a way that they might have wanted it, right? And I think similarly in that when you have such like unfettered hordes of capital here, there's going to be a mix of automation, there's going to be a mix of attempts to cut labor costs, but then the larger question is like, okay, if there's a concern about jobs and employment, like what is the alternative going to be? Is the alternative that we want, like, we do want 3 million jobs, but they're for making weapons, or do we want like 3 million jobs in another way, shape, or form? Like, is there a way in which we can provide those in the industry that is not also still feeding the problem here, which is, there's this massive growing armament and bloodthirst and war industry that erodes and incentivizes the erosion towards these sorts of conflicts, or ginning up towards these sorts of conflicts that we want to avoid, right? Or the development of technologies that we want to avoid, right? Or the financialization of things that we want to avoid. Like, how do we preserve and bolster employment while doing that? And I don't know particularly, but I do think that that's like something I think about also with other industries that venture capital has touched and taken advantage of misclassification, underemployment, the need for labor that people have.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest questions in terms of if you wanted to shift away from the direction we're going now. There was a question about how do universities fit into this picture? Shana,
they are front and center. I've noticed the business schools, including MIT, Harvard, obviously Stanford, are just hosting a really robust schedule of conferences about defense tech, which I guess we should maybe even just unpack that word defense tech, because it's a very soft word for surveillance technologies, offensive weapons, cyber weapons, all sorts of different stuff that falls under the umbrella of defense and sounds a little more cuddly than perhaps it is. But obviously, historically, research universities have been really intimately linked to this space. There's various labs at places like Johns Hopkins that are really tied up in the machine learning military space. And for those of us who recently saw Oppenheimer, this is not a new phenomenon. These technologies have long been intimately tied up with academic space, but I do think there's a kind of hopeful note from Oppenheimer, which is that scientists sometimes get it and understand the ethical quandaries and the power of the technologies they're working on, and can help raise some of these questions in a pretty robust way.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Oppenheimer himself, it was sort of the story of his moral quandary about this, but there were large numbers of scientists who started organizations like the Federation of American Scientists, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, and became advocates of arms control or abolition of nuclear weapons, the Pugwatch Group internationally. So there's no guarantee that everybody's going to buy into this. And so I think that is a helpful note. There's somebody's whole class is watching this, which is a good way to build your numbers. And so one of the students asked, would nationalization of the military industrial complex curb the influence of venture capital?
I remember we had this previous Quincy event maybe like a year ago. And that was my sort of big sign off was, if you don't want the profit motive to be driving foreign policy decision making, you have to take the profit motive out of the process of foreign policy. And yeah, the only way to do that is to literally nationalize the military industrial industry. Lots of other countries have much more sort of direct control over their industry. I don't think that there's, so often when we think about these really transformative policies, people say, well, that's just not possible. But if you look back maybe a decade or 2 decades or 3 decades previous, turns out that those policies actually did exist. The US did have price controls under Nixon, right? I mean, we have had massive mobilizations of the entire population in the pursuit of one sort of outcome. You think of like war mobilizations and all of the things that would be possible if the government, if the state would actually do something. Right. And I think control over the military industrial complex and military industrial production would go a long way into making foreign policy decisions less about the profit-driven interests of extremely powerful lobbies in the US. And we would have better outcomes sort of across the board, not just in terms of employment, the provision of public infrastructure, but also in terms of the US repeatedly getting itself involved in these really sort of endless overseas conflicts.
So we're getting up on 5 minutes. I want to give the panelists a chance if you have any, final comments or questions that we should look into going forward. So whoever wants to volunteer, or I can call on people, whatever works.
I think, when we were looking at specifically venture capital, but also private equity, right? These are fields that have already, in the limited time that they've existed, totally perverted incentives, development of entire sectors and industries. And, in the case of venture capital specifically, but this also applies to private equity, there are now places that they've influenced, whether it's the gig economy or whether it's healthcare, where we face the real prospect of like a permanent privatization or a permanent barrier that they've instituted themselves, from taking care of workers in there, from ensuring, good and humane working conditions, but also from integrating that into, a better vision for what kind of transit or healthcare system that we might want. And so, that should be also a warning sign that the desire to emulate them, whether it's different branches of the military trying to make their own venture capital funds, whether it's, increased networking with these people, whether it's attempts to bring them on in and replicate the ecosystem that has done so much damage to the rest of the country. And the way in which labor is able to operate, the way in which capital and private decisions dictate the course of people's life, it should be a warning sign to try to figure out how do we, either create a firewall or purge it. Because if they have their way, we will now have to deal with even more fanatic, dangerous, delusional, profit-seeking, and on top of an already dangerous, lethal endeavor, which is like the weapons development and the tendency and ease with which it will go towards warmongering or ginning up a conflict, and what knockdown effects that will have on the rest of society. And so I think like this is a very important topic, right? How do you get financiers out, and is a part of the puzzle of how to also ensure that we can stop wars and conflicts from happening.
Yeah, that's right. And this is a whole other flow of money on top of that, government investment that's, spiraling towards $1 trillion a year. Yeah, Shana or Jonathan, who wants to weigh in next?
I'll just quickly say that, that tension between private equity, venture capital, defense tech on the one hand, and the majors, right, the primes or the OEMs, Lockheed, et cetera, on the other hand, you think that there is necessarily a tension. But, in the past, most of the innovation that happened was from the primes just buying up these very early stage defense technology solutions, right? So they were not innovating internally, right? They were finding these little tiny tweaks that existed that applied to their weapon systems, and they were just buying up those firms, right? And they have their own corporate venture capital arms, right, in these big firms. And so now, basically, that defense tech ecosystem, they want to exist outside being gobbled up by the primes because they're being driven by the sort of the logic of investment capital that says, if you can hold out longer, right, if you can get bigger, then we can have multiple rounds of investment, and we can have more and more people, more and more investors who are actually who are profiting from these multiple rounds of investment, so that there's actually more sort of surplus capital being produced from that process, as opposed to just getting gobbled up in that very initial instance by the primes. So you do have these sort of different factions, I guess, of capital that are battling it out. And I think that's sort of what you're seeing right now. And who wins, I don't know, but we all lose, I guess, regardless of which one of them wins.
And Jonathan, do you have any final thoughts?
I want to make one final point, which is more in the specific than the general, which is there's this private equity group called Pine Island Capital Partners. And what would you know, by coincidence, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin had a seat there, as did Secretary of State Tony Blinken. And this is a private equity firm that invests in some new military-related technology, machining parts. And I remember Axios did a story around the time of nomination campaign zone, which said, we're going to be expect to hear a lot more about Pine Island Capital Partners. And sort of surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, we haven't heard much about it. So I think that's the role of researchers and reporters here, is to keep reminding citizens, voters, people that are paying their taxes toward these new technologies and advancements that many of our public figures, of public servants of both parties, are immensely tied up in investment groups. But it happens very quietly. So I just want to thank you all for hosting this conversation, because it's important that we draw attention to these quiet trends.
Thanks. Well, I want to thank our panelists and everybody who tuned in. Quincy is going to stay after these issues in various forms, because one of our goals is to both expose how the military-industrial complex works, but also try to figure out if there's ways to reduce its political and economic power and its influence over our military and foreign policies. So if you want to know more about what we're up to, if you go to quincyinst.org, you can hit the events, tab and find out about future events. You can read our reports and articles. And if you go to Responsible Statecraft, you'll get kind of breaking stories about things like this. So thanks again to the panelists. Thanks to all of you. And, let's do this again.